Namaskar. We will continue from the discussions that we last had. Business definition as given by section 2 clause 13 was discussed. Today we will consider the meaning of capital asset. As I have told you, in a definition, the framing of the sentence is very important. The word means restricts the application of this definition. The scope is restricted to what is given. Capital asset means is how this is worded. Section 2 clause 14. This is indeed a very litigious definition. A lot of litigation takes place in this. They have been at times amending this definition. They have already done it. Before I go into analyzing this, let me give you the text of the section. I am reading the text now. Section 2 clause 14. Capital asset means subclause A, property of any kind held by an assessee, whether or not connected with this business or profession. It says property of any kind held by an assessee, whether or not connected with this business or profession. This term any kind is very wide. Property of any kind. It can be movable, it can be immovable. Both properties are included here. It is further stating whether it is connected with his business or profession or not. Meaning, personal property is included in the meaning of capital assets. The business assets also are included in the meaning of capital assets. I will specifically refer to two business assets. There are two business assets commonly known to you. One, see the balance sheet, recall the balance sheet, stock in trade, and the fixed assets, the capital assets used for the purpose of business. So, stock in trade and fixed assets are the two capital assets. But then I will make a little disclaimer in this a little later, or rather an explanation a little later in respect of stock in trade. It further says, subclause B, any securities held by a foreign institutional investor, FII, any securities. You should be aware, in our country we have FIIs operating, foreign institutional investors operating in our country on the stock exchange, purchase and sale of shares. The securities which they hold is stock in trade. This was clause B. Property of any kind held by the assessee, whether or not connected with his business or profession, was clause A. To both these clauses, they further say, in respect of both these clauses, they further say, but does not include stock in trade. What it means is, if a person has stock in trade, which is obviously his business asset, then that stock in trade is not included in the meaning of capital asset because they have specifically excluded. Please understand, the framing of a definition is extremely important. The basic clause to section 2 clause 14 subclause A, the basic clause, subclause A, included all assets, property of any kind. So since it had already enlarged the meaning of capital asset to include even stock in trade, they have by a specific provision excluded stock in trade. Now you understand, we had referred to two business assets. One was stock in trade, other was fixed assets. So what are they excluding? Only stock in trade, meaning stock in trade is not capital asset for the purpose of section 2 clause 14 capital asset definition. The fixed asset, plant and machine, has not been excluded. Other fixed assets also have not been excluded from the meaning of capital assets. So they remain a part of capital assets. As I told you, it is important to firstly understand the meaning of the terms used. When we do the head capital gains, this capital asset will bear significance. Just to illustrate the difference between the heads of income, you will now realize that stock in trade is a part of business asset, but it is not a capital asset. So if it is not a capital asset, gain which a person makes on sale of business stock, the stock in trade, will not be considered as capital gains income, for the simple reason that the stock is not capital asset. Therefore gain on sale of stock is not capital gains. You are aware, stocks when sold gives gains, which is, as you are aware, gross profit. That is business income. So sale of stocks gives us business income. That will not be the case when an assessee sells the other capital asset, fixed assets. If you happen to make a gain on sale of fixed assets, say plant and machine, factory premises, office building, office equipments, if a gain is made on sale of these capital assets, it would not be business income. Emphatically, please understand, it would not be business income. We discussed that when an assessee, a person, sells his stocks in trade, income from sale of stock in trade would be considered to be business income. Why? Because even if stock in trade is otherwise a property and included in the meaning of capital assets otherwise, but by specific exclusion, they have excluded stocks from the definition of capital asset. So to summarize, stock is not capital asset. If it is not capital asset, income cannot be brought to tax under the head capital gains. As we had discussed earlier, capital gains, capital assets when sold gives capital gains, income chargeable under the head capital gains. As stock in trade is not capital asset, it would be included under the head business income if capital asset, if stock in trade when sold gives income. So to summarize, sale of stock is business income, gain is chargeable under the head business income, gain on sale of fixed assets is capital gains income. I hope this is clear. Similar is the case with FII also. If FIIs hold securities as stock in trade, gain on sale of these securities would be considered to be business income. Please understand, stocks held by anybody, whether FII or by domestic assessees, stocks when sold gives us business income because they have been excluded from the meaning of capital asset. There is another exclusion from the meaning of capital assets. They are adding subclause 2, small Roman 2. I will not go into too much of technicalities. They have excluded firstly stock in trade. Another exclusion from the meaning of capital asset is personal effects. Now we need to know what is personal effects. The clothes that we are wearing is personal effect. The jewelry which you wear on your person, on your body, is personal effect. The car which you own and use for family is personal effect. Furniture at home, TV, fridge, sofa, are all personal effects. They are excluded from the meaning of capital assets. Please understand, if a property is capital asset and if there is a gain on sale of such capital asset, income is capital gains. What follows as a natural corollary to this is, if a property is not a capital asset, gain on sale of this property cannot be brought to tax under the head capital gains. Please understand very clearly. If the asset is capital asset, gain is capital gains. If asset is not capital assets, gain cannot be capital gains. I hope it is clear. Personal effects do not fall within the meaning of capital assets. They are excluded. So, if personal effects that we have discussed, motor car, jewelry, house, TV, fridge, these are all personal effects. If personal effects are sold, gain would not be capital gains. Why? Because personal effects are excluded generally from the meaning of capital asset. But again, there is a rider here. In income tax, nothing is simple. What they have stated is, personal effects are excluded from the meaning of capital asset. So, if you sell personal effects, since it is excluded from meaning of capital asset, gain cannot be brought to tax under the head capital gains. Simple. Not a capital asset, sold, not a capital gain. Simple. But that's not all. There is a rider. Now, when they are generally excluding personal effects from the meaning of capital asset, they are further stating that certain capital assets, though included in the meaning of personal effects, certain capital assets, though personal effects, are not excluded from the meaning of capital asset. Please understand, certain personal effects are not excluded, meaning they remain as capital asset. Certain personal effects are not excluded. I will give you a list: jewelry, archaeological collection, drawings, paintings, sculpture, or any work of art. Each of these are further subject to various interpretation, which I am not going into. I will come to house a little later. The house which you stay is again a personal effect. Now, jewelry is not included in the meaning of personal effect, which is excluded, meaning jewelry is a capital asset. In short, these assets which I have just discussed, jewelry, archaeological collection, drawings, paintings, sculpture, work of art, these are all included in the meaning of capital assets. So what will happen if you sell jewelry, archaeological collections, drawings, paintings and other assets? They are included in the meaning of capital asset. Gain will be chargeable as capital gains. I hope this is clear. So personal effect includes, as we were discussing, personal car, personal wearing apparel, the clothes that we wear, furniture. So if you sell these personal assets, personal effects, a motor car used for family use, an antique piece of furniture, old furniture, antique piece of furniture, if sold, may give you huge income, but since that asset does not fall within the meaning of capital asset, it is excluded from the meaning, the gain will not be capital gains. I hope this is clear. Then we have agricultural land in exclusion. When I say agricultural land, I will not refer to the act, I will refer to certain general explanation without going into the technicalities. Agricultural land has to be situate in India for it to be excluded from the meaning of capital asset. Meaning, if you have an agricultural land in India, please understand, generally, we will come to specifics little later. Agricultural land in India is excluded from the meaning of capital asset. But there are riders to it. If agricultural land is held within the local limits of a municipality or a cantonment board, then such a capital asset is not excluded. It is included in the meaning of capital asset. This agricultural land, if is held in an area which falls within the municipal limits or within the area of a cantonment board, military area, then it is not excluded. Such agricultural asset is included within the meaning of capital asset. Agricultural land is included within the meaning of capital asset. Similarly, they have specified distances between 2 to 8 kilometers. Distance from the end of municipal limits to alphabet 2 to TO2 8 kilometers, 2 to 8 kilometers area beyond municipal limits. So if a person holds an agricultural land somewhere between 2 to 8 kilometers, meaning up to 8 kilometers of the municipal limits, such an agricultural land situated in this area is also not excluded from the meaning of capital asset. It is included in the meaning of capital asset. So what will happen if you happen to sell such a agricultural land which is located within 8 kilometers? It will be income chargeable under the head capital gains. Please understand, capital asset agricultural land situated within municipal limits or within 8 kilometers of the municipal limits. 8 kilometers of the municipal limits. So meaning where the municipal limits end, from that limit within 8 kilometers. If it is situated, the asset agricultural land will be included in the meaning of capital asset. Gain on sale would qualify to be capital gains. Hope this is clear. This 2 to 8 kilometers is in respect of various specified areas the government specifies. For example, 8 kilometers beyond within municipal limits of Mumbai city. So wherever there is a municipality, for example, in very simple terms, if you have an agricultural plot out of Mumbai, let us say in a rural area, then you have to find out if it has to be not to be included in the meaning of capital asset. You have to find out where is the end of the municipal limit, and if your asset agricultural land is situated more than 8 kilometers away from the end of that municipal limit, then that agricultural land has not to be included in the meaning of capital asset. It is, in other words, an agricultural land in a rural area which is sought to be exempted from tax. Meaning, if you have an agricultural land in a rural area, that agricultural land will not be included in the meaning of capital asset. Gain on sale of such an agricultural land cannot be brought to tax under the head capital gains. I hope I am clear. To summarize this issue of agricultural land, agricultural land situated in municipal area or cantonment board area is a capital asset. Gain will be chargeable to capital gains. Agricultural land situated within a limit of 8 kilometers from the end of municipal limits, it will also be included in the meaning of capital asset. Gain will be chargeable to tax as capital gains. agricultural land situated beyond 8 kilometer, that is after 8 kilometer, it will be included as exempted asset, meaning it will not be brought to tax. Gain on sale of such an agricultural land will not be brought to tax under the head capital gains. Now there will be intricacies involved in this which I am not introducing to you here. How do you calculate 8 kilometers? How do you calculate? Do you calculate the distance of the road, end of municipal limits? From that place, how do you calculate 8 kilometers? The length of the road, the way the roads are constructed. How do you measure the distance in accordance with the flow of the road as to how the roads are made? How do you measure the distance of 8 kilometers according to the road distance? Answer is no. By the flight of a crow, you measure the distance. In simple words, will a crow fly after the municipal limit? Will a crow fly straight, or will he take the route of the road? Obviously, the crow will fly straight. Flight of a crow. That is how you measure the distance of 8 kilometers, straight distance. There will be intricacies furthermore, which I am not discussing. So you can now sense how complex income tax is. We were discussing exclusion as to what is not included in the meaning of capital asset. We said stock in trade is not included, personal effects are not included, but then there are certain personal effects which are included. Jewelry, archaeological collections, drawings, paintings are included. Agricultural land is generally not included, but agricultural land situated in municipal area or within 8 kilometers of that area is included in the meaning of capital asset. Gain will result into capital gains. You have another 3 exemptions. 6.5% gold bonds. There are other gold bonds also, which in details I am not going into. Gold bonds, special bearer bonds issued by the government. Even gold bonds issued by the government, special bearer bonds issued by the government, and gold deposit bonds again issued by the government, central government. All these 3 bonds, gold deposit bonds, special bearer bonds, 6.5% gold bonds, are excluded from the meaning of capital asset. Meaning, if you hold these bonds, you may sell the bonds, you may make a gain, it will not be brought to tax. So to complete the definition of capital asset, we said that capital asset means property of any kind held by the assessee, whether or not used for the purposes of his business or profession. This property of any kind, as we discussed, is a very wide term. It includes house property. House property is not a personal effect. Personal effect includes only movable properties. So house property is included in the property of any kind. It is very much a capital asset. Gain on sale of house will be chargeable to tax under the head capital gains. Of course, methodology 54, 45, 48, 54 EC, all those provisions will be given effect. That's a different question, but gain on sale of a house will be chargeable to tax under the head capital gains. Come to the next definition now. Company. For the purposes of Income Tax Act, company means an Indian company. A company which is incorporated in accordance with the law of Indian Companies Act. You are aware we had the Act of 1956, which has been replaced by Act of 2013. So any company registered in accordance with these acts qualified to be company. They are Indian companies. You would also recall that even a foreign company can register a subsidiary company in India. You are aware, you can form a company can form another company. So a foreign company can also form an Indian company, meaning register that company, may be subsidiary or associated enterprises. We are not going into details of associated enterprises. A foreign company registering a company in India. Foreign company is the parent company, Indian company is the subsidiary company. Company also includes a foreign company. A company registered in accordance with the laws of a foreign country, foreign legislation, Foreign Companies Act, would also be considered to be company in accordance with the Indian Income Tax Act 1961. A company would also mean a CBDT company. CBDT means Central Board of Direct Taxes. That is the apex, the topmost body administering the income tax law in our country. It directly functions under the Ministry of Finance. It has about 8 members. CBDT may, by general or special order, bestow the status of company on a non-company. For example, a partnership firm may be considered to be a company by CBDT order. So then that partnership firm will be a company. So company means Indian company, foreign company and CBDT companies. Here a distinction needs to be understood with reference to LLP, Limited Liability Partnerships. You are aware about the infirmities, about the difficulties of a partnership firm. A partnership firm has partners. You will recall that the liability of the partnership firm falls on the partners also. So the liability of partners is essentially unlimited. If a partnership firm is not able to repay its liabilities, its loans, the personal assets of the partners will be required to be sold and the liabilities of the partnership firm repaid. This is the problem with the partnership firm functioning. You are aware a company form of organization has a limited liability concept. You are a shareholder of a company, you have agreed to subscribe to 1000 shares of rupees 10 each, meaning 10,000 rupees. Your liability to the company is only up to rupees 10,000. Once you pay 10,000 rupees to the company, nothing more is payable by you. Your liability is restricted. If you were a partner in a partnership firm, the liability of a partner is unlimited, the liability of a shareholder of a company is limited. We have LLP, limited liability, as in case of a company, partnership. So the purpose of LLP Act is to amalgam, consolidate the benefits of partnership and company, which is known as LLP, Limited Liability Partnership. The word partnership here is important because for income tax purpose, LLP is considered to be partnership. Though if you have to form an LLP, you have not to go to the registrar of firms, which is at Bandra. You have to go to registrar of companies, Nariman Point, Marine Lines. Of course, now it is online. So LLP, though it is a partnership, registration is done by the company registrar. For income tax purpose, it is a firm. Partnership firms are registered under the Indian Partnership Act 1932 with the registrar of firms, which is the state registration. Maharashtra state does that registration, whereas LLP is a central government registration. This was companies. Now we have 231 person. Section 2, clause 31 defining person. Person includes, this is an inclusive definition. There are types, categories of persons. An individual is a person. Partnership firm, company, as we have just discussed. Partnership firm includes LLP also. Then we have AOP, Association of Persons. I will explain this. We have BOI, Body of Individuals. We have AOP, which means persons coming together and forming an association. Persons here does not mean only individuals. Any person that we are discussing can come together, or any combination of these persons can come together and form an AOP. Contrast this with BOI, Body of Individuals only. You will recall joint venture. Joint venture is largely which you did was of individuals. So a joint venture will be considered to be body of individuals. It is not a partnership. So in the category of persons, we have individuals, we have firms, partnership firms, we have companies, AOP, BOI, HUF, Hindu Undivided Family. Once a person is married, he gets the status of HUF. Hindus are having this special privilege. Muslims cannot form Muslim undivided family. Christians don't have the benefit of Christian undivided family. What is the advantage? Your father, an income tax assessee, he pays income tax. He may form an HUF. An HUF is another person within the person. Meaning, if your father forms an HUF, your father Mr. X will be having his own income tax pen, his income tax file, and the HUF, X HUF, this will be another entity having its own pen, having its own income tax file. It has its own income, much different than your father's income. In an HUF, the family members become natural members, as against a partnership firm where membership is by admission, specific admission. In case of an HUF, membership into the HUF is mere birth. Birth is sufficient in the family to admit you as a member of the HUF. So your father has formed an HUF, assuming your mother, you, your brother, and other siblings of yours will be members of your father's HUF. Hindu undivided family. And then we have the last category, artificial juridical person. Now here it is interesting. Some time back I had discussed that the income tax department does not leave even the godheads, the deity. They charge tax even to the deities. Artificial juridical person, example is the godhead, the deity whom you worship. Let me give you an interesting illustration. At times in the good old days in our villages, we had people having huge fire where they used to have their small mandir. Consider this: a person who has a mandir in his fire gets up one fine morning and claims that somebody in the night had deposited, let us say, 50 lakh rupees in this mandir as an offering. Now this mandir is maintained by me. I am the owner of this house and this mandir also. So this 50 lakh rupees belongs to me and is not an income chargeable to tax because it is not given to me. If the person were to aspire to give this amount to me, why should he come in the evening? He would have come in the day and handed it over personally to me for it to be considered to be my income. But that's not the case. He hasn't given the money to me. He has, as he claims, offered it to the deity, to the godhead. Let us restrict ourselves purely to the income tax issue arising out of this. That person is filing his own income tax return. In that return, he does not want to show 50 lakh rupees as his income and pay tax on it, 30% tax, 15 lakh rupees. He doesn't want to pay that. Here the law says the deity, maybe it is not a registered trust as Siddhi Vinayak Trust, Mahalakshmi Trust. They are registered trust, Lal Bagh Ka Raja Trust. They are registered trusts. Consider this. These trusts will add these amounts received as offerings to their income. Taxability of trust is not the issue here. We will discuss that later. That is not in your syllabus. But the fact is that this income is included in the incomes of the trust. When you offer offerings in the Danpeti, in the Hundi of Siddhivinayak temple, it goes to the trust. The trust includes that in its income. Lal Bagh Cha Raja, whatever offerings it gets, it is included in the trust income. What about this 50 lakh rupees distributed by this person? He says this is not my income, rightly so. But then the law says we have AOP, artificial juridical person, according to which this deity, even if it is not a trust, even if it is not registered under the Income Tax Act, the person who maintains the deity will be required to take the registration of this godhead, of this deity, as a person under section 2 clause 31. Registration PAN number, registration means PAN number. Permanent account number will be taken of the deity, 50 lakh included in the deity's income and accordingly offered to tax. So you see, the government doesn't even leave the gods. They bring even the gods to tax. Before I go to the next definition, I am reminded of a very interesting issue. Before I go to definition of income, section 2, subclause 24, a very interesting definition. Let me ask you, ponder it over. The government brings income to tax. A person may have illegal incomes from illegal sources. Pyara Singh versus CIT is the case which comes to my mind immediately. A person has incomes from illegal sources. In our country, Haji Mastan, Yusuf Patel, Kareem Lala, they were all gangsters engaged into several illicit activities, but they paid taxes on their incomes. That's a different question to ask whether they paid their taxes even on illegal incomes is a different issue, but they paid taxes. Criminals also pay their income tax. They are required to pay their income tax. The question to ask is, should the government bring illegal incomes to tax, income tax? Should it bring it to income tax? A person has an illegal income, maybe say from bootlegging or smuggling or any kind of a corrupt activity or a prohibited activity. Do you think the government will be able to recover tax on that income? Pyara Singh's case illustrates this point very well. The answer is simple. Even illegal incomes are chargeable to tax. Government will recover tax even on that illegal income. Pyara Singh's case, Dr. T. A. Qureshi case, both are illustrations to explain this. The government, having recovered tax on income, will not stop here. Supposing a person is into smuggling, if he has paid tax on the income generated from smuggling activities, the government, income tax department, will furnish these details of the smuggling income to the customs. Customs will come and again confiscate or do the proceeding, conduct the proceedings under the Customs Act. That's a different question. But even illegal income are chargeable to tax. The color of income, the nature of income has no relevance for the purposes of determining the taxability. All incomes, legal, illegal, moral sources, immoral sources, legitimately earned, illegitimately earned, all incomes are chargeable to tax. What is chargeable is the income, irrespective of the manner of its earning, irrespective of the source of earning the income. Section 2, clause 24, dealing with income. One of the hugely litigated section. Please understand, the tax on income has been in existence since the time human being started living in a society. Since then, there is tax on income. Yet, despite the efforts of the legislation, not only of India but of other countries as well, despite the abundant efforts of the supreme courts of various countries, the high courts of various countries, and despite the elapse of this long a time since the time human being started living in society, from that time till this time, thousands of years have elapsed, yet definition of income has not been complete, has not been exhaustive. It's only an illustrative definition. It only gives you instances, illustrations, possibilities of income. It only gives you the sources from which a person can earn income. The list is not complete. It includes various sources, various items of income. I don't intend to go into those details. It is a big list. Section 2, clause 24. I'll just give you a few of them from the Act. It includes business income, it includes capital gains income, it includes voluntary contributions, a charitable trust, for example, Lal Bagh Charada, it receives donations. That is also a part of income. We are not discussing the taxability on that income. We are only trying to understand that a trust receiving voluntary contributions is a part of income. Then you have perquisites. This is relevant in case of salary. When we discuss salary, we will discuss this issue. Perquisites. Special allowances received by a person, again, is a part of income. We are not discussing taxability. We are only trying to state, we are not discussing whether it is taxable or not. We are only trying to discuss whether it is income or not. We are discussing the incomes. We are giving illustrations of income. Value of any benefit or amenity, allowance is granted, some chargeable under the head profits and gains of business or profession, and so on. Big list. So these are the definitions and the meaning given to these terms. They will have to be appropriately invoked, taken a recourse to for the purposes of interpreting the terms used in this Act. Now let me go to the other sections. We have section 4 and section 5. It will be interesting to note that there are two categories of section, two types of sections: charging section and machinery section. This would need explanation. charging section and machinery section. Again, the section does not say that it is a charging section or a machinery section. Like the section did not say whether it were an inclusive definition or it was an exhaustive definition. The definition didn't say that. The section didn't say that. Likewise, this charging section doesn't state it is a charging section. Machinery provision does not state it is a machinery provision. You have to understand. Again, the usages, the terms used, the composition will determine whether a section is a charging section or a machinery provision. I am using two words, section and provision. They largely mean the same thing. There isn't any much difference. There isn't any difference in it practically. Provision, Provision. Provision has, meaning a section, has to be understood with a proviso. Proviso. Provision is a section. Proviso is added to a section separately. Proviso generally makes an exception to the section, meaning what is stated in the section may not apply when a proviso is read. A proviso will make an exception. Section will apply generally. Proviso will give instances, examples where section will not apply. We will discuss this a little later at length. But for the time being, understand machinery section vis-a-vis procedural or charging section vis-a-vis machinery or procedural section. Machinery or procedural, laying down the machinery, laying down the procedure, laying down the format. A charging section, as I told you, we have to understand from the wordings. A charging section essentially will have the word charge. If charge exists in a charging section, or if charge exists in a section, it means it is the charging section. It is because of this charging section that the government is able to recover tax, charge that income to tax. If there were no charging section, government would not have been able to recover tax. Charging section versus machinery section. K.P. Varghese Supreme Court judgment interestingly deciphers this. I will discuss that later. Charging vis-a-vis machinery provision. Machinery provision merely lays down the methodology, merely lays down the calculation. That does not mean that once you have calculated the income, it will automatically become chargeable to tax. No, there has to prevail charging section for the income to be brought to tax, for the charge to be levied on the income. Machinery section prescribes the methodology, the working. This plus this minus this is income. That is machinery. That is procedural. It is the charging section which lays tax on the income. Each head of income, salary, house property, profits and gains, capital gains, other sources, each head of income has its own charging section. Apart from this section 4, which is itself a charging section. It is because of the charging section 4 that the government derives the power to bring the incomes under the 5 heads to tax. Charging versus machinery section. Section 5 deals with the scope of total income. I would be able to explain section 5, the effect of section 5, by taking illustrations with you. Therefore, I will not deliberate much on section 5, dealing with the scope of total income. In a way, it is also a charging section. So, section 5, I will deal with you in the classroom. Illustrations will help, examples will help you understand this better. Then we have section 6, a very, very important section. In this last budget, Madam Nirmala Sitharaman made significant changes to this section, and as she was reading the budget speech, as in her budget speech, as she finished the budget speech suggesting changes to section 6, there was a huge uproar in the stock market. There was a huge uproar in the non-resident Indian community in Dubai, and in more particularly in Dubai and in other foreign countries. They were all concerned as to how will their taxability be affected upon this new amendment to section 6. Of course, that amendment is not a part of your syllabus. I will discuss that with you later in the class. But now I will give you the section 6 as it exists for assessment year 1920. And also for 2021. Your syllabus will be 2021 assessment year. Section 6 deals with the residental status. It has clauses. Residental status is purely an income tax status. It is in no way concerned with citizenship. Citizenship is of no consequence in determination of residental status, though the effect of citizenship is taken in the residental status determination later on. I will explain this. Immediately, citizenship is of no consequence. I should say that Indian citizenship will be a beneficial position to be in for certain purposes. Integrities we will discuss later. Let me come to the basic issue. You would, as I told you, it is purely an income tax status determined only on the basis of number of days stay in the territorial jurisdiction of India. Only this. Number of days stay in the territorial jurisdiction of India goes into determining the residential status. In the previous year, financial year 1920, April 19 to March 20, during that financial year, the number of days stay will be considered to determine residential status for assessment year 2020-21. You will recall, you would have certainly heard that non-residents always say, I cannot stay in India for more than 182 days, 182 days. That figure of 182 is firmly ingrained in their grey cells. They have understood that figure correctly, 182 days stay correctly, because if they stay in India in a particular financial year, April to March, for a period exceeding 182 days, 182 days or more, 182 days or more, if they stay in India for a period exceeding 182 days, 182 days or more, then they become resident in India. Now, residential status has its own tax implications. A resident in India is chargeable to tax on his world incomes, Indian and foreign incomes. A non-resident, mind you, I am not referring to citizenship. I am not referring to Indian citizen, foreign citizen. No. A resident in India, determined on the number of days stay, is chargeable to tax in India for his world incomes, on his world incomes, Indian and foreign. A non-resident, a person who has stayed in India for 181 or less number of days. A non-resident in India is chargeable to tax in India only on his Indian incomes. A non-resident presently is not required, assessment year 2021 till that time, he is not required to pay tax on his foreign incomes. A non-resident doesn't pay tax on his foreign incomes. A non-resident pays tax only on his Indian incomes in India. With this as the background, let us go to section 6. 182 days or more stay in the country determines the residential status. As I told you, section 6 has clauses. It doesn't have subsections. It has clauses. Now, if a person has to be considered to be resident in India, there are two conditions. Anyone may be satisfied by him for him to be a resident in India. First condition, 182 days or more stay in India, either at one time or at various times in the same financial year, April to March 1920. If a person stays in India for a period of 182 days or more, he becomes a resident in India. This is condition 1. Condition 2, or. Mind you, there is or, so any one of the two can be satisfied. If we are concerned with the previous year 1920 assessment year 2021, if we are concerned with this assessment year 2020-21 determination of residential status, then in the previous year, in the accounting year 2019-20, 60 days or more stay, and in the earlier 4 previous years, 18 ended, 19 ended, 18 ended, 17 ended, 16 ended, 15 16, 16 17, 17 18, 18 19. In these 4 years, if he has stayed for 365 days or more, 365 days or more in the last 4 previous years and 60 days or more in the current previous year. Current previous year is 1920. 365 plus 60. If he stays, these two conditions have to be satisfied simultaneously. 365 and 60 simultaneously. So if a person stays in India for 365 days or more in the last 4 previous years and 60 days or more in the current previous year, then he becomes a resident in India. I think this is clear. Till this point, citizenship has no role to play. Till this point of residential status determination, citizenship has no role to play. Now comes the role of citizenship. Indian citizens and persons of Indian origin, PIOs, person of Indian origin. You will be aware that many of our countrymen left India years back and settled in foreign lands. They have been there for hundreds of years, but they still have some Indian connection, Indian base. Vajpayee ji thought of a very noble plan, a very, very noble plan. He said, you come back to India, but you don't have Indian passport. You come to visit your relatives, friends, family functions, family deity. I will allow you a free entry in this country. You may come whenever you want. You will not need a visa. Please understand, they were foreign nationals now. They don't have Indian passport. They have foreign passports. So Vajpayee ji issued to them something known as OCI, Overseas Citizen of India card, OCI card. Person of Indian origin. So they can come to India whenever they want without the need of a visa. They are foreign nationals, but persons of Indian origin. So they were given OCI card and they come to India undertake investments in India, undertake business in India, they contribute to the Indian economy, and that's how they are able to be connected with this country. Coming back, for such persons, citizens of India and persons of Indian origin, the citizenship and person of Indian origin gives them an advantage with respect to the second condition. You will recall there are two conditions which we have discussed. First was 182 days. Second was 365 plus 60. 365 last for 60 current year. So this 60, if you would understand, if you would be able to relate, let us take your brother's case. Supposing he is settled in a foreign country. He is not a person of, he is still an Indian, he still holds an Indian passport, let us say. He has been away for the last maybe 10-15 years. He doesn't come to India often. But once he comes to India, he will like to stay. He will like to meet his parents, friends, relatives, brothers, and so on. 60 days, he may have stayed in India in the last 4 years for 365 days or more. And if he stays for more than 60 days, which is 2 months, he becomes a resident. Then what will happen? Not only his Indian incomes are either way chargeable. Not only his Indian incomes, his foreign incomes also become chargeable to Indian income tax because he is a resident in India. 365 plus 60. He has exceeded this limit of 60. He has exceeded 365 days also in the last 4 years and 60 also in the current year. So he becomes a resident in India. He will have to suffer income tax on his foreign incomes also in India. There obviously be a reluctance, not a reluctance, retaliation. Why will he want to pay tax in India on his foreign incomes? He will pay taxes there. And he will pay taxes or on his foreign incomes in a foreign country, and he will pay taxes on Indian incomes to the Indian government. It makes sense. But if you ask him to pay tax on his foreign incomes also in India, there will be a lot of retaliation. He will never want to come back to India, at least for a period more than 60 days. But don't worry, there is an advantage, there is a relief available to citizens of India and persons of Indian origin. What the law says is that these persons, if they are going out of India for the purpose of employment or as a sailor on an Indian ship, then this 60 in the current year has to be read as 182. 365 remains as it is. This is the case of a citizen only, not of PIO. This is the benefit for a citizen only. PIO is included or not? Let me see. Yeah, only Indian citizen. PIO is not included for this purpose. Sailor on an Indian ship or employment out of India. Indian citizen has this advantage. This 60 has to be considered as 182. Now you apply this. Your brother goes out of India for the first time in the current year. So he may be here in India for 181 days or less. He has always been in India. So that first condition of 365 days in the last 4 years is easily met. To additionally meet the second condition, he can stay in India for 181 days or less, meaning about 6 days, 6 months, and still retain the non-resident Indian status. So if he goes out, he stays in India, let us say more than 60 days, he stays for, let us say, 165 days, let us say, he stays in India, which is less than 182. So he is not a resident in India. For being a resident, he has to satisfy 365 plus 182 or more. Less than 181, 181 or less, comfortable, not a problem. He can stay in India for 181 days, as in our case, he stays in India for 165 days in India and goes out for the first time. He is out of India for 200 days, he earns income there. That income will not be brought to tax in India. That income from foreign employment or the sailor will not be brought to tax in India. But if he stays in India for, let us say, 185 days, goes out of India for the first time in 1920 and stays in India for, let us say, 185 or 190 days, then he has a difficulty. Then his foreign incomes also will be brought to tax in India, at least in this year, 2021 assessment year, not later. So your citizenship comes to your advantage, Indian citizenship. This is not available to a foreign national. Now come to the advantage to both Indian citizen and PIO. Coming back, here we discussed a case of going for the first time from India. Now come to a case where they come, your brother comes back for a family function, or a person of Indian origin comes here for some function or investments, whatever it is, setting up a plant, person of Indian origin and a citizen of India coming back. This 60 days has to be read as 182. See the advantage now. They may come and stay in India, citizen of India and person of Indian origin may come and stay in India for 181 days or less, and yet they will continue to be non-resident even in the accounting year 1920, that means assessment year 2021. They will continue to be non-resident. Only this advantage is available only to Indian citizen and person of Indian origin while they come to India on a visit. I am not going into much details about visit. That will open a Pandora's box as to what will visit mean. What should visit mean? Visit essentially has an intention of going back. You say, when you go out of India, you say you have visited, let us say, Maldives. You have visited, let us say, Singapore. The intention is to come back, therefore it is visit. You don't migrate to those countries when you say visit. So coming back, your brother may stay for 181 days or less, meaning 6 months approximately in a year, in this year 1920, and yet continue to have the non-resident status. Non-resident status at times is considered to be a very coveted, a very important status. Nobody will like to leave that status or relinquish that status once they get it for the obvious advantages. Of course, Madam Nirmala Sitharaman has changed Section 6 provisions. Of course, it will not be draconian as it was proposed in the budget. When it was proposed in the budget, maybe it was not introduced properly to her by her bureaucrats, or maybe it was not received properly by the community, Indian diaspora in foreign countries. Yet now the dread, the problem which was found in the budget speech no more exists. But it is not as simple as it is, or as advantageous, not simple, it is not as advantageous to the non-resident Indians as it is till assessment year 2021. From assessment year 21-22, when this provision will be effective, they will be put to some disadvantage. All the advantages presently available may not be available, but of course this corona scare may pronounce the government to continue with the present status. That's a different issue. That is for the government to decide. I am only speculating, considering it, because the government has already come out with several benevolent measures in the wake of coronavirus scare. This was residental status, a part of residental status. Resident and non-resident. If you stay in India for less than 182 days, then you are a non-resident. Simple. 182 days or more, resident; 181 days or less, non-resident. There is an in-between status, resident but not ordinarily resident, and resident and ordinarily resident. These I will discuss in the next class. Thank you very much for a patient hearing.